The ordinary day that wasn't. The sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and pink as James O'Connor leaned against the side of his school bus, sipping from his battered thermos. It was his daily ritual, a few quiet moments before the controlled chaos of the afternoon bus route. James wasn't just a bus driver. He was a guardian, a watchman, a quiet protector of the students he transported every day. In his 10 years on the job, he had seen it all. Kids laughing, crying, fighting, making up, and sometimes showing up with bruises they couldn't explain. He knew every child by name, every habit, every quirk. And that's why he noticed when Emma Carter wasn't quite herself that day. She wasn't running out of the school building with the other kids, laughing and shouting. She wasn't lingering in the hallway with her best friend, Lily, before heading to the bus. Instead, she emerged from the school alone, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast, clutching the straps of her backpack so tightly that her knuckles were white. James' gut twisted. Something was wrong. "Hey there, Emma," he called out casually as she stepped onto the bus. Emma didn't respond. She walked straight to the back, her usual spot, and curled up against the window. James hesitated. He wasn't one to pry, but something about the way she moved, slow, hesitant, like she was carrying an invisible weight, made him uneasy. A few more students climbed aboard, filling the bus with the usual chatter. But James' eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, watching Emma. Something wasn't right. As he prepared to start the bus, Emma suddenly stood up and walked toward him. James turned slightly in his seat, concern deepening. "What's up, kiddo?" he asked softly. Emma hesitated, glancing around. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "He's watching me." James felt a cold chill creep down his spine. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. Emma swallowed hard, her lower lip trembling. Her eyes darted toward the school entrance, then back to James. She leaned in just a little closer and whispered 3 more words. "Please help me." The words hit James like a freight train. He had heard fear in a child's voice before, but this was different. This wasn't just a kid who was scared of getting in trouble at school. This was terror. James took a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral so as not to alarm the other kids. "Okay," he said, nodding. "I've got you, Emma. Can you tell me who's watching you?" Emma's hands gripped the bottom of her hoodie. She hesitated, looking around the bus, and then, so quietly that James barely heard her, she whispered a name. "Mr. Holloway." James' heart stopped. Mr. Holloway, the beloved history teacher, the one parents always raved about, the one who stayed late after school to help struggling students, the one who, just last week, had been given an award for excellence in teaching. Something wasn't right. James' mind raced. He knew he had to act fast. But he also knew he couldn't panic. Not yet. He gave Emma a reassuring nod. "Okay, you did the right thing telling me, Emma. Stay right here, all right? I'm gonna make a quick call." Emma nodded, her eyes wide with fear. James pulled out his phone, his heart hammering in his chest. He dialed the school office, but the line rang and rang. No answer. His gut clenched tighter. He considered calling the police, but what if he was wrong? What if this was just a misunderstanding? Then again, what if he wasn't? His decision was made for him when, just as he was about to put his phone away, he saw Mr. Holloway step out of the school building. Their eyes met across the parking lot. James felt the hair on his arms stand on end. Mr. Holloway's expression was unreadable, but something about the way he stood there, hands tucked into his pockets, watching the bus, watching Emma, made James' blood run cold. James made a split-second decision. He locked the bus doors. Then, without a moment's hesitation, he picked up his phone and dialed 911. "This is James O'Connor, school bus driver for Ridgeway Elementary," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. I have a student on my bus who says she's in danger. We need immediate police assistance." The dispatcher's voice was quick and professional. "What's the threat?" James exhaled slowly. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But a child just told me she's being watched by a teacher, and she's terrified. And right now, that teacher is standing outside my bus, staring at us." There was a pause. Then the dispatcher spoke. "Officers are on their way." James hung up, keeping his eyes locked on Mr. Holloway. And then, Mr. Holloway started walking toward the bus. James' pulse skyrocketed. This wasn't just an ordinary day. And something told him this was only the beginning. Shadows in the rearview mirror. James O'Connor's fingers curled tightly around the steering wheel, his pulse drumming against his ribs as he watched Mr. Holloway approach the bus. The teacher's gait was slow, deliberate, his expression unreadable. James had dealt with his fair share of angry parents, bratty kids, and even the occasional school administrator breathing down his neck. But this was different. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. James cast a quick glance at the rearview mirror. Emma was still standing near the front of the bus, her face pale as paper, her breathing shallow. The other kids had started to notice something was off. Some were whispering, while others simply watched with wide, curious eyes. James kept his tone calm. "Emma, go sit down. Everything's fine." She hesitated but obeyed, retreating toward her seat. Mr. Holloway reached the doors and rapped his knuckles against the glass. James didn't move to unlock them. Instead, he rolled down the driver's side window just an inch, enough to hear Holloway, but not enough to let him in. "Mr. O'Connor," Holloway said smoothly, flashing his usual friendly smile. "I think there's been a little misunderstanding." James didn't smile back. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Holloway tilted his head slightly. "Emma forgot something in the classroom. I was just coming to let her know she can grab it before she leaves." James flicked his eyes to the rearview mirror again. Emma was shaking her head furiously. James turned back to Holloway, his voice carefully neutral. "I'll make sure she gets it tomorrow." Holloway's lips pressed together into a thin line. The smile was gone. "I really think it would be best if she came with me now." Every instinct James had screamed at him not to let that happen. "Sorry," James said evenly. "But once a kid steps onto my bus, they're under my care until I get them home." Holloway's jaw tightened ever so slightly. His fingers twitched in his pockets. James glanced past him, scanning the parking lot. The school staff had already started leaving. The police weren't here yet. "James," Holloway said, his voice quieter now, almost conspiratorial. "I think we both know you don't want to make a scene here." James smiled, slow and deliberate. "Then maybe you should step away from my bus." Holloway's eyes flickered. For the first time, there was something behind them. Annoyance, frustration, fear. James couldn't tell. What he did know was that Holloway wasn't expecting him to push back. And that alone was enough to set off every alarm bell in James' head. Something was very, very wrong. Holloway exhaled sharply, shaking his head like he was dealing with a stubborn child. Then, to James' surprise, he took a slow step back. "Suit yourself," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "But you'll regret this." James didn't respond. He just watched, muscles coiled like steel, as Holloway turned and walked away. It wasn't until the man disappeared into the school building that James let out a slow breath. A murmur of voices rose from the kids behind him. He turned in his seat, giving them all a reassuring smile. "All right, folks, we're heading home." The kids quieted, but their expressions were uneasy. James turned back to the road, shifting the bus into gear. His eyes flicked to the mirror again. Emma was watching him, wide-eyed. It was going to be a long ride, the longest drive home. James pulled out of the school parking lot, his mind racing. The usual chatter on the bus was subdued. Even the rowdiest kids were unusually quiet. As they rolled through the streets, James' focus kept shifting between the road ahead and the mirror above him. Emma sat motionless, her gaze fixed on her lap, shoulders hunched. James made a decision. At the next stoplight, he reached up, flipped on the intercom, and spoke in a low, calm voice. "Emma, could you come up here for a second?" The girl hesitated, then slowly got up from her seat, walking to the front of the bus. James kept his eyes on the road. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. I think Mr. Holloway hurt Lily." James' knuckles turned white against the wheel. "Lily?" he asked carefully. "Your best friend?" Emma nodded. "She hasn't been in school for 2 days." James inhaled slowly. "And why do you think Holloway had something to do with it?" Emma's breath hitched. "Because she told me she was scared of him. And yesterday I saw him put something in her locker. When I went to look at it later, it was gone." James felt ice creeping into his veins. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. And it was getting worse. The bus jolted slightly as the light turned green, and James eased forward. His mind raced, trying to piece things together. 2 days missing. Holloway pushing to get Emma alone. The fear in her eyes. James made a decision. He wasn't dropping her off at home yet. An unexpected detour. James reached the intersection, where he was supposed to turn onto Emma's street. Instead, he kept driving straight. Emma stiffened. "Mr. O'Connor." James kept his voice calm. "We're making this stop first." Her eyes widened with understanding. "Lily's house." James nodded. Emma didn't argue. 10 minutes later, they pulled up to the Carter residence. It was a well-kept suburban home, the kind with a neatly trimmed lawn and a mailbox shaped like a little house. But something was wrong. The lights were off. The curtains were drawn. James put the bus in park and turned to Emma. "Stay here." He stepped outside, walked up the driveway, and rang the doorbell. No answer. He rang it again. Still nothing. A flicker of movement caught his eye. He turned sharply, his pulse spiking. A figure stood in the backyard, half hidden behind the fence. James' breath caught in his throat. It was Lily. And she was mouthing something. "Help me." James didn't hesitate. He spun around, running back to the bus. "Emma, get back in your seat. Buckle up." Emma scrambled back, eyes wide with fear. James threw the bus into gear and stomped the accelerator. They had to get to the police. Now. But as they peeled away from the curb, James caught something in the mirror, something that made his stomach drop. A black car parked down the street. The moment James started driving, it pulled out, following them. He tightened his grip on the wheel. They weren't alone, and he had a feeling this was only the beginning. The chase that changed everything. James O'Connor's hands were steady on the steering wheel, but his mind raced. The black car that had pulled out behind them wasn't just another vehicle on the road. It was following them, and he had a sick feeling he knew who was inside. Mr. Holloway. James checked the rearview mirror. Emma was clutching the straps of her backpack like a lifeline, her knuckles white. "Emma," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I need you to stay buckled in, okay?" She nodded quickly, but her eyes darted to the mirror, watching the black car too. James pressed his foot down on the accelerator, keeping his speed within legal limits but making sure he wasn't stopping at any unnecessary red lights. They were supposed to be heading to the police station. But now he wasn't sure they were going to make it without a fight. The streets of the quiet suburban neighborhood felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. The kids in the bus were still talking, but their chatter had gone down. They could sense something was wrong. The black cars sped up. James clenched his jaw. This wasn't a coincidence, and if Mr. Holloway was willing to follow a moving school bus to get to Emma, that meant one thing. He was desperate. A guardian's decision. James had always believed that being a bus driver wasn't just about getting kids from school to home. It was about protecting them when their parents couldn't. And right now, Emma needed him more than ever. He knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go straight to the police station. If the black car followed them there, they might lose time while trying to get help. And time was something they didn't have. He needed to lose the car first. James took a sharp right turn onto a smaller street. The black car followed. "Okay, Holloway. Let's see if you're as good at driving as you are at lying." James wasn't just any driver. He had spent years navigating unpredictable roads, weaving through traffic, handling this massive bus like it was an extension of himself. Now he was about to use every bit of that skill to protect Emma. He turned again, this time onto a road with a sharp downhill slope. "Hang on," he warned the kids. A few of them yelped as the bus picked up speed, rolling faster down the hill. James kept his grip firm, steadying the bus as they cut through another intersection. The black car hesitated at the stop sign, just for a second. But it was enough. James slammed the bus into another turn, leading them onto a busier road. They were getting close to downtown now, where there were more witnesses, more traffic, more people. He had an idea. If he could get the bus into a crowded area, Mr. Holloway wouldn't be able to make a move without someone noticing. A school bus speeding through empty streets. That was easy to chase. A school bus pulling into a parking lot surrounded by cops, parents, and cameras. That was a different story. James spotted a shopping center up ahead. Without hesitating, he cut across 2 lanes and pulled into the parking lot. The black car was forced to slow down behind a long line of cars. James exhaled. Got you. He wasn't stopping, though. Instead, he swung the bus around the side of the building, past a loading dock, and out onto the next street. By the time the black car got through the shopping center, James and the bus were gone. The truth comes out. James slowed his breathing, keeping the bus at a steady speed now that they had shaken their tail. He turned onto the road leading to the police station. "Emma," he said softly, "you did good, kiddo." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, finally, she whispered, "I was really scared." James glanced at her through the mirror. "You're safe now." Emma bit her lip. Then, hesitantly, she spoke again. "Mr. O'Connor, what if Lily's still in danger?" James tightened his grip on the wheel. "We're gonna make sure she's safe. I promise." The police station came into view. James pulled the bus into the front parking lot and put it in park. He unbuckled his seatbelt, then turned to face Emma. "Come on, kid. Let's tell them everything." The FBI steps in. The moment James and Emma stepped into the police station, things escalated. At first, the desk officer had looked confused. But the second James mentioned Mr. Holloway's name, everything changed. Phones started ringing. Officers whispered to each other. And then, they called the FBI. James stood protectively beside Emma as agents swarmed in. It turned out, Mr. Holloway wasn't just a teacher. He was a wanted man. He had changed his identity multiple times. Every time he got close to being caught, he moved to a new town, started fresh. And now the FBI had been tracking him for months. James felt sick. If Emma hadn't spoken up, what would have happened? The thought made his stomach turn. The school goes on lockdown. Within minutes, the entire school was locked down. FBI agents surrounded the building. Parents started showing up, frantic, asking what was going on. James stayed close to Emma. She had started this, and now she was about to save more kids than she even realized. Then one of the agents rushed over to them. "You said Emma saw Holloway putting something in Lily's locker." James nodded. "That's right." The agent exchanged glances with the others. "We need to check that locker immediately." Lily's secret message. The police escorted James, Emma, and 2 FBI agents back to the school. They headed straight to the lockers. James could feel Emma trembling beside him. He gave her a reassuring nod. "You're doing the right thing, Emma." She swallowed and nodded back. One of the agents cracked open Lily's locker. Inside, they found a folded-up piece of notebook paper. The agent slowly opened it, and in small, shaky letters, Lily had written, "He's voyaging MA. Please help." James' heart sank. They weren't dealing with just a bad teacher. They were dealing with a predator. A race against time. The moment the agent unfolded the note, the air in the school hallway turned thick with tension. James O'Connor stood frozen, his eyes locked on the words scrawled across the paper in shaky, desperate handwriting. "He's voyaging MA. Please help." Emma let out a small gasp beside him, clutching her backpack like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Agent Carter, the FBI lead on the case, clenched her jaw. "We need to find Lily. Now." James' heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about Emma anymore. Somewhere, Lily was out there, and she was in danger. The empty house. "We tried contacting Lily's parents," Agent Carter told James as they stormed toward the school office. No answer. James exhaled sharply. "That's because I saw Lily at her house." Carter stopped in her tracks. "What?" "She was in the backyard," James explained quickly. "She was hiding. I saw her mouth the words 'help me.'" Agent Carter didn't hesitate. She turned to the officer beside her. "Get a unit to the Carter residence immediately. If Lily's still there, we need to bring her in." The officer sprinted off. James' stomach churned. He had known something was wrong the second Emma whispered those 3 words. "Please help me." But now, the nightmare was real. Lily wasn't just missing. She was hiding. From him. The secret room. James, Emma, and the agents rushed through the school hallways, moving toward Mr. Holloway's classroom. "We need to search his office," Carter said. "If there's anything connecting him to Lily, we need to find it before he covers his tracks." The door was locked. James stepped back, his muscles tensing. "Move." Then, with a grunt of effort, he kicked the door open. The room was eerily neat, too neat. No stacks of papers. No clutter. Nothing that looked personal. Agent Carter signaled to another agent. "Tear this place apart." Within seconds, the FBI was flipping over desks, pulling open drawers, searching for anything. Then, over here, an agent had moved the bookshelf aside, revealing a small door. James stepped forward. "Is that a closet?" Emma whispered. James had a terrible feeling. One of the FBI agents yanked the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit space. A desk, a chair, and a row of photographs pinned to the wall. Pictures of students. James' stomach turned to ice. Agent Carter stepped forward, her face hardening as she scanned the photos. One face stood out among the rest. Lily. And underneath it, a schedule, with today's date circled, and written in neat, careful handwriting. Final meeting, 4 p.m. James glanced at the clock. 3:45 p.m. His blood went cold. They had 15 minutes. The chase begins. The radio on Agent Carter's belt crackled to life. Suspect spotted leaving the school parking lot in a black sit-in. James felt his pulse spike. "Holloway," he muttered. Agent Carter didn't hesitate. "Everyone, move. We're not letting him get away." James wasn't an agent, but he wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. Without thinking, he turned and ran toward the parking lot. "James," Carter called after him, but he was already sprinting. A guardian's instinct. James burst into the parking lot just in time to see the black sedan screeching toward the exit. Without hesitating, without thinking, he ran straight for his school bus. If Holloway wanted a chase, he was going to get one. He threw open the bus door, jumped inside, and slammed his foot on the gas. The bus lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. James wasn't a cop. He wasn't a soldier. But he was a bus driver, and he was going to use everything he knew about these roads to stop Holloway. The roadblock. The black sit-in weaved between cars, trying to lose them. James gritted his teeth. Not today, Holloway. He knew these streets better than anyone. He flicked the radio on. This is James O'Connor, school bus driver. I'm in pursuit of a black sit-in, heading north on Parkway Avenue. Suspect is Holloway. The dispatcher's voice crackled through. Mr. O'Connor, you are not advised to engage. Too late. James saw where Holloway was heading. The train tracks. If he got past those, he'd be gone. James floored it. The engine roared to life. He cut straight through an alley, jumping a curb, barreling onto the side street just ahead of Holloway. And then, he swerved the bus sideways, blocking the entire road. Holloway's sit-in came skidding to a stop, inches from the bus. Then, the sound of sirens. Police cars surrounded the sit-in. Holloway had nowhere to go. James jumped out of the bus, heart hammering. Just as FBI agents swarmed in, Holloway tried to run. They tackled him to the ground. It was over. Lily is safe. The next day, James got the news. Lily had been found, safe. She had been hiding in her neighbor's shed for the past 2 days, too terrified to go home. Mr. Holloway had planned to take her somewhere that afternoon. But now, he was behind bars. James sat in his bus seat, hands resting on the wheel, staring out at the school. He had always known that his job was more than just driving the bus. But now he knew it. Because today, a bus driver saved a life. And he would do it again. The hero no one expected. The day after Mr. Holloway's arrest, James O'Connor woke up to silence. No sirens, no tires screeching, no desperate chases through the streets. Just the faint hum of his ceiling fan and the early morning light spilling through his window. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling. Had it really happened? Had he really used a school bus to block off a fugitive teacher from escaping? Had he really helped save Emma and Lily from something terrible? The soreness in his muscles told him, yes, it was all very real. James sighed, sitting up in bed. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Hello. A woman's voice, firm, professional, came through the line. Mr. O'Connor, this is Special Agent Carter with the FBI. James immediately tensed. Agent Carter, good morning. I just wanted to personally thank you for what you did yesterday, she said, not just for calling 911, but for everything. You put yourself in danger to protect those kids. James ran a hand through his hair. I just did what anyone would have done. There was a pause. Actually, no, Agent Carter said. Most people wouldn't have done what you did. That's why I'm calling. I wanted to let you know that Mr. Holloway is officially in federal custody. He won't be getting out anytime soon. James exhaled, relief washing over him. Good. That's good. There's something else. James frowned. What is it? We've been looking deeper into his background, Agent Carter said. Holloway has been changing his identity for years. We found evidence that he's been involved in similar cases in multiple states. But this time, thanks to you and Emma, we got him before anything worse happened. James' stomach tightened. Before anything worse happened. He closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. If Emma hadn't spoken up, if he hadn't believed her, if he hadn't stopped that bus at the right time, Lily might not have been found at all. James swallowed the lump in his throat. What about the kids? Are they okay? Agent Carter's voice softened. Emma and Lily are with their families. They're shaken up, but safe. We have a team offering counseling for them and their classmates. They've been through a lot. James nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Yeah, they have. Another pause. Then Agent Carter said something that caught James off guard. Mr. O'Connor, the FBI could use people like you. James blinked. Wait. What? You have sharp instincts, Carter said. You notice things. Most people would have brushed off what Emma said, But you listened. You took action. James chuckled, shaking his head. I'm a school bus driver, Agent Carter, not an FBI agent. You're a guardian, Mr. O'Connor, she corrected. And that's exactly the kind of people we need. James didn't know what to say to that. So he just said, I appreciate it. Agent Carter's voice was warm. Take care, James. And if you ever change your mind, call me. The line went dead. James sat there for a long time, staring at his phone. Had he really just been offered a job with the FBI? The school bus hero. When James arrived at Ridgeway Elementary later that morning, he expected it to be like any other day. It wasn't. The moment he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed the crowd. Dozens of parents, teachers, and students stood gathered outside the school. Some held signs, others clapped. James blinked in confusion. What the? Then, before he could react, the entire crowd turned toward him and started cheering. James froze. A woman, Mrs. Carter, Lily's mother, stepped forward, holding a microphone. Mr. O'Connor, she called out, her voice carrying over the noise. Would you come here, please? James hesitated. He wasn't one for the spotlight. But the moment he saw Emma and Lily standing in the front row, smiling at him, he knew he couldn't just sit there. He stepped off the bus, adjusting his jacket awkwardly. Mrs. Carter turned to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, this man right here, James O'Connor, saved our children. Another round of applause erupted. James felt his face heat up. I just did my job. Mrs. Carter shook her head. No, Mr. O'Connor, you went above and beyond your job. You saw something was wrong, and you didn't ignore it. You saved Emma. You saved Lily. And today, we want to thank you. James didn't know what to say. Then, Emma stepped forward. She held out a small envelope. This is for you, she said softly. James took it and opened the flap, pulling out the handmade card inside. On the front, written in colorful marker, were the words, Our Guardian. And inside, the whole school had signed it. James felt his throat tighten. Emma smiled. Thank you for believing me, Mr. O'Connor. James cleared his throat. Anytime, kid. A new beginning. Later that evening, James sat in his quiet home, staring at the FBI agent's card on his table. For years, he had told himself he was just a bus driver. But today, he realized he was something more. A protector, a guardian. And maybe, just maybe, his job was only just beginning. A hero's burden and the truth uncovered. James O'Connor sat in his school bus long after the cheering crowd had dispersed. His fingers traced over the words on the handmade card. Our Guardian. It wasn't a title he had ever imagined for himself. Bus drivers weren't supposed to be heroes. They weren't supposed to chase down criminals, outmaneuver kidnappers, or work with the FBI. They were supposed to drive kids home safely. And yet, James had done all those things. He exhaled slowly, setting the card aside as he looked up at his rearview mirror. The bus was empty now, but it didn't feel that way. Because in his mind, he still saw Emma. He still saw the fear in her eyes when she whispered those 3 words. Please help me. He still saw Lily's tiny, terrified frame, hiding in her neighbor's shed for 2 days, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice she was missing. James squeezed his eyes shut. He had saved them. But how many other kids had slipped through the cracks? How many had asked for help, only to be ignored? James' fists clenched on his lap. He knew he had done the right thing, but the weight of it pressed down on him like an iron chain. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more to Holloway. And that meant more kids might still be in danger. The dark web of secrets. An hour later, James was sitting inside Agent Carter's office. He hadn't planned on coming here today. He had planned on going home, having a stiff drink, and pretending he wasn't still thinking about Holloway. But instead, here he was, because his gut wouldn't let him rest. You're back already. Agent Carter raised an eyebrow. closing a manila file on her desk. "What's on your mind, James?" James leaned forward. "I want the truth, Agent Carter. All of it." Carter studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she slid the file across the desk. James hesitated before opening it. Inside were dozens of reports, some old, some new. Some had Holloway's face on them. Others had different names. James' stomach twisted as he read. This isn't his first time." His voice was barely above a whisper. Carter nodded grimly. "He's been doing this for years. Different towns, different schools, different names. Every time the walls closed in, he slipped away and started over." James flipped through the pages. It wasn't just Lily and Emma. There were other kids. Some had disappeared. Some had tried to speak up, but no one listened. And some were never found. James clenched his jaw. How the hell did he keep getting away with this? Carter sighed. Fake credentials, loopholes in school hiring policies, and unfortunately, people in power looking the other way. James' stomach churned. "You mean he had help?" Carter's expression darkened. "There are people who protect men like Holloway. Sometimes it's schools that don't want bad press. Sometimes it's higher-ups who don't believe kids when they speak out. And sometimes," she hesitated, "it's something worse." James didn't like where this was going. "How much worse?" he asked quietly. Carter tapped on the file. "We believe Holloway was connected to a larger network. One that preys on vulnerable kids. One that uses schools as hunting grounds." James' blood ran cold. This wasn't just about one bad teacher. This was bigger. And Holloway wasn't the only one. James exhaled sharply, closing the file. "So what now?" Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "Now we hunt. Holloway might be behind bars, but we want the whole damn system that helped him stay free for this long. We're looking at hiring records, administration logs, security footage, everything." James nodded. Then, before he even realized he was saying it, the word slipped from his mouth. "I want to help." Carter tilted her head. "Help how?" James met her gaze, steel in his eyes. "I spent a decade behind the wheel of that bus," he said. "I know these kids, I know these streets, and I know when something isn't right." Carter was silent. Then, after a long moment, she said, "Are you saying you want in, Mr. O'Connor?" James exhaled. He thought of Emma. He thought of Lily. He thought of all the kids who still needed protecting. And he nodded. "Yeah, I'm in." The Guardian. A week later, James was back on his usual bus route. But everything had changed. The school had new security measures. The principal had resigned in disgrace for failing to act sooner. And kids were talking. For the first time, students felt safe enough to speak up. James had seen it himself, kids whispering in hushed voices to their teachers, to counselors, to the officers assigned to the school. And people were listening. That was his doing. James had spent years thinking he was just a bus driver. But now he knew the truth. He was more than that. He was a guardian. And as long as he had one good breath left in his body, no child under his watch would ever be ignored again. Because when a child whispers for help, James O'Connor listens. The road never ends. The world had moved on, but James O'Connor hadn't. It had been weeks since the events that shook Ridgeway Elementary. Weeks since Emma whispered those 3 haunting words, since Holloway had been caught, since the truth had come to light. But James still felt it every time he stepped onto his bus, every time he looked into his rearview mirror, every time he saw a child glance over their shoulder, still afraid of the ghosts that lingered in their past. Some wounds didn't heal overnight. And James, he wasn't done yet. The unfinished business. James had spent the last decade thinking he was just a bus driver. Now he knew he was something else. A protector, a guardian, and somehow an investigator. Because while Holloway was locked away, the bigger story was still unraveling. The FBI had uncovered files, hidden documents, falsified school records. And at the center of it all, more names, more people, more predators who had been using the system to their advantage. James had seen the case files with his own eyes. Holloway was just one of many. And that made James furious. So when Agent Carter called him and asked if he'd be willing to keep an eye on certain things around town, on certain schools, certain staff members, certain concerns that the Bureau was still investigating, he didn't hesitate. He said yes, a bus driver with a badge. James never considered himself the law enforcement type, but now he had a direct line to the FBI. Not as an agent, not as a cop, but as something better. Because cops didn't see what he saw. Agents didn't know what he knew. They weren't inside schools every day, hearing the whispers, watching the silent cries for help. James was. And when Carter gave him a list of names, people in the school system still under investigation, he memorized them. Teachers, principals, volunteers, people who didn't belong near kids, and James made it his job to watch them. Not with a gun, not with a badge, but with his instincts. And those instincts, they were rarely wrong. A new shadow in the hallways. It started small. A new substitute teacher at Ridgeway Elementary. Mr. Danvers. Friendly, warm, a little too eager to be involved with students outside of class. And James, he noticed. He noticed how Danvers spent more time watching than teaching. How his gaze lingered too long on the students. How Emma, who had finally started smiling again, went quiet whenever Danvers was nearby. James' gut twisted. So one afternoon, as the kids filed onto the bus, he leaned down to Emma and asked, "What do you think of Mr. Danvers?" Emma hesitated, and in that hesitation, James found his answer. He straightened up, watching Danvers as the man walked across the parking lot. James didn't have proof yet, but he knew. He had that same feeling he'd had when Holloway stood outside his bus. That same gut-wrenching certainty. Danvers wasn't just another teacher. He was something else. And James, he was about to find out exactly what. The first move. That night, James made a call. Agent Carter answered on the first ring. "Tell me about Danvers," James said, skipping the pleasantries. Carter was silent for a beat. Then, "What did you notice?" James told her. The way Danvers acted around kids, the way Emma reacted to him, the way it felt too familiar. Carter exhaled. "We had suspicions about him, but nothing concrete." James clenched his jaw. "Then let's make it concrete." Because Holloway had slipped through the cracks for years. James wasn't going to let that happen again. The trap. The next morning, James arrived at school earlier than usual, and he waited, watched, observed. And by the time the bell rang, his suspicions were confirmed. Because Danvers was watching Emma, just like Holloway had. James' fingers curled into a fist. But this time, he wasn't waiting for things to escalate. He wasn't going to let it get that far. The confrontation. That afternoon, as the kids were heading to the buses, James waited until Danvers was alone in the hallway. Then he walked up and said, "We need to talk." Danvers turned, raising an eyebrow. "Excuse me." James didn't smile. "You know exactly what I mean." Danvers' eyes flickered, just for a moment. A flash of something beneath the surface. Then he smirked. "Ah, you're the bus driver." James nodded. "Yeah, I'm also the guy who put your friend Holloway behind bars." Danvers' face changed. The smirk disappeared. And in its place, something darker. James took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I don't know what you're planning, but I'm telling you right now, I'm watching." Danvers didn't move, didn't blink. And then he smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. And James felt his stomach drop. Because Danvers wasn't scared. He was amused. Like this was a game. "You think you can stop me?" Danvers murmured. James' jaw tightened. "Try me." the future of a guardian. Danvers wasn't caught that day. Not yet. But James wasn't done. Because now he had proof. He had FBI agents ready to move. He had students who trusted him. And most of all, he had experience. He had learned from Holloway. And this time, he wasn't waiting for things to go too far. James O'Connor wasn't just a bus driver anymore. He was something more. Something stronger. Something that would never let a child go unheard again. Because when kids whispered for help, James O'Connor listened. And now, he would never stop listening. The end, or just the beginning. Final takeaways. Some people wait for someone else to act. Others step up. Be the one who steps up. One person can make a difference. Even a bus driver. Even you. Listen. Watch. Protect. Because every child deserves a guardian. James O'Connor started as a school bus driver. But now he's the one thing predators fear the most. A man who listens.